For some background information, I'm a 24-year-old male. I live in northern Canada, and this experience happened to me when I was 22. I was heading back to my house from my friend's place. My friend lived about 18 kilometers away from the city I live in at the time this experience occurred. It was a cold summer night, and I was heading down the highway on my motorcycle. One part of this highway gets really dark, and you can barely even see the road. This was unfortunately my downfall, as my motorcycle hit a really bad pothole in the road and wrecked. I was injured and in shock. I got up and started walking. It was pitch black, the type of darkness where you can barely see your hands in front of you. I could hear the usual sounds of nature, wolves howling, foxes crying, and even the sounds of coyotes in the woods surrounding the road. I had walked for 4 hours, and I finally got to the corner of the highway that you take to head into town. This part of the road has a fair stretch of streetlights, which give you an extra sense of relief and comfort. As I walked along the now well-lit road, I started to get really tired from how long I had walked, but the pain from my accident kept me awake and made me desperate to get home soon. I was just about to pass a local construction company's yard when I noticed the air had gotten really still and quiet. So quiet that you could hear a pin drop from a mile away. Then I heard a noise that surprised me. It sounded like a splashing noise, which would make sense. There was a marsh near this part of town. I stopped and waited to hear another sound. Yet, another splash came from the darkness. I froze, and I felt my blood start rushing from fear and adrenaline. I reached for my phone and activated the flashlight feature to get a better look at the source of the noise. What I saw next was utterly bone-chilling. What my flashlight illuminated was an assy figure that was crouched on a boulder near the edge of the marsh. It looked emaciated and very unnatural. Shaking at this point, I called out and said, "Well, what the hell are you?" It slowly turned its head and stared back at me with a haunting, empty eye. It seemed to glow a deep crimson color. Then it let out this horrifying scream that sounded like a cross between the roar of a mountain lion and the scream of the ring race for Lord of the Rings. I started running as fast as my body would let me go, as I could hear splashing behind me, no doubt chasing me. I pulled out my knife, preparing to fight for my life, but then it stayed just out of reach for me. When I hit the streetlights, it seemed not to want to hit the light. I could see slowly skulking in a predatory style. But just as I thought I was going to lose my life to this creature for sure, a pair of headlights came over the horizon and shone on the creature. It then cried one more time before running off into the night. I haven't seen it ever again, but one thing is for sure. I make sure I always walk with a friend anywhere at night.
It was me and my cousin. Let's call him Alex. It was a summer night not too long ago. The year was 2015, and it was a little after 11:30. Our uncle and grandma lived next to each other in our small town in Missouri. And in this story, we saw the most bizarre thing we'd ever seen, and we're sure that it wasn't normal. Anyway, it was just our usual summer night. The two of us were running around playing night tag and other silly games that children do. At one point, the adults went inside to get some drinks, so they left Alex and I outside to play. We were walking from our uncle's house to our grandma's, since they are close neighbors, to tell her we were playing cards, a thing we do every Thursday night. There is one streetlight on the end of the road, so it was almost completely pitch black. All we had was a large flashlight, a tool that we had borrowed from our uncle. We were talking about games and other things we wanted to get, and that's when we heard it. A loud and terrifying screech. We both, out of instinct, fell to the ground. I looked up, and what I saw made me scream. "What in the world is that?" I yelled. Alex looked up and pointed the flashlight in the direction of the noise. The trees were in the way, but in between the sparse leaves, we could faintly see the outline of something big. It wasn't a bird, and it was way too big to be a bat. The creature then darted behind a tree, and we suddenly lost sight of it. We thought it was gone, so slowly we calmed down, then darted to the overhang on my grandmother's porch for safety. Just as we began to run, we heard the screech again. This time it was closer, and it was ear-piercing. "Screw this, man," Alex yelled. As we bolted to our grandma's, I looked up and saw the silhouette flying in the direction of our grandma's place. And I'm sure that Alex saw it too, because he instantly stopped, turned around, and ran the other way. Now we were running back to our uncle's house, not stopping to look back at that thing once. We ran inside, slammed the door, and got stares of confusion from our panting. Alex's little sister asked what was wrong, and we explained what the heck had just happened. His sister didn't believe us, not much to my surprise. She thought we were just trying to scare her, so she headed out the door to prove that it was fake, that we were just lying. We stood outside with our baseball bats, ready to attack anything that flew towards us. But we didn't hear it or see it again that night. We've encountered this creature a few more times, but the last time we heard it, my friend Gabby was there too. Each time it feels even more terrifyingly bone-chilling than the last. Now, we don't dare leave the house past 11 when we visit. We've never seen the creature up close, but the screech and the shadow flying around is enough to give us nightmares. We believe that what we saw is known as the Turkey Creek Monster, as we live extremely close to that area. In fact, we grew up hearing stories of the flying demon. I don't know if the legends are true, but I know for dang sure we heard something that night. We saw something not of this world, and I feel grateful that we're here today, able to share this story.
A few years ago, I had an experience that scared the holy crap out of me. My family had a tendency to take in local kids from rough families, with the parents' permission, of course. My buddy Joey had been living with my family for about 2 or 3 years at the time. One of his friends, who we'll call DB, would come over from time to time to play the Xbox or just hang out. At the time this story takes place, DB had gotten kicked out of his apartment. He moved in with my family to live in the building, a small storage shed that my brother had turned into his man cave. Though he started out as Joey's weird friend, he and I became pretty close. When I was helping move in, I came across a leather-bound journal. I asked him about it, and all he said was, "Whatever you do, don't look in it." Since I'd already found several of his sex toys, I assumed it was full of personal stuff, which I really didn't want to know. A few weeks went by, and some things happened, and he ended up sleeping with my fiancée. So, still upset, I read it. The first page was a warning not to read any further. I don't remember exactly what it said. On the next page was an extremely complex symbol, stars and circles and some old language I couldn't recognize. It wasn't a pentagram, but something similar. The rest of the book was blank. I just assumed he was a mega nerd and closed it. After confronting him about my fiancée, he was so apologetic, and he seemed sincere. We were all really drunk when it happened. So I forgave him, and we started hanging out a lot. At one point, I told him I'd read the book, and he asked what I'd seen. I told him, and he seemed relieved when I said the book was blank. He said it was best that I couldn't see the rest of it. I just shrugged it off as more nerd stuff or something, and called him Merlin and Gandalf all week. A few days after this, my fiancée at the time ended up regularly getting with him and telling me about it. I only stayed with her because of sex, if I'm honest. Figured I could get laid a few more times before we broke up completely. But then Joey found out. Though we were in an open relationship, he threatened to tell my family. This is where my story begins. After finding out Joey's intentions, DB told us he was going to talk with his contact and figure out what to do. After a bit of arguing, he let me tag along. He asked if I had any incense, and I did. I assumed some more nerd stuff, and he took my incense, chalk, his book, and a walking stick up to the road about a quarter mile from my house. He drew a circle on the road with chalk. He drew some symbols around the circle, then drew a larger circle that he stood in. Then, he placed incense at different symbols and lit it. Then placed the stick in the smaller circle, while we stood in a larger circle. He opened his book As he flipped through it, I could see words on the pages that I hadn't before. He told me, "You may want to cover your ears," and I pretended to do so. I couldn't quite hear what he was saying, but as soon as he started speaking, I immediately noticed a change. My neighbor's horses started getting spooked. I saw birds fly out of trees, and this was at about midnight. I saw a possum run out of the woods, a raccoon run out of the woods, and even the bugs around the streetlights take off in every direction. The entire time I had a sense of impending doom and an unexplainable fear that just wouldn't go away. It seemed like every living thing wanted to get away from us. Then, DB began to speak. It didn't sound like him, though. It almost sounded like Bane from The Dark Knight Rises or Hermaris Mora from Skyrim. But scarier. It was as if DB was talking to himself in two different voices. That is when I really plugged my ears. I was afraid of what the thing had to say. After a few minutes, DB tapped me on the shoulder and said, "It's time to go home." I asked what it said, and he told me Joey wouldn't say anything. We went home, and a few days later, my fiance ran off with DB. Looking back, I still get chills thinking about that thing to this very day.
When I was a little girl, first or second grade I believe, we moved to a small farming town in Colorado. I attended elementary school there and did not have a lot of friends, and so one little girl with reddish-brownish hair asked me to play. We soon became good friends, and she asked me to spend the night with her. I agreed, and my parents brought me over to her apartment. Her family lived in the apartments across from the school. Her parents actually owned them, and there was only 4 units, 2 on top and 2 on bottom. Her sister stayed in the unit below her parents. She was in her early 20s. She also had a younger sister who was in preschool. A little while after I got there, her parents said they were going out to a local bar for the evening. Apparently they did this a lot and left us there alone. They told us that her sister was downstairs if we really needed anything and gave us the number to the bar. This was the era before cell phones, which shows my age. They left and locked the door behind them. Her sister left an hour later saying she was going to get her friend and would be back shortly. I have never been alone like that without someone watching me, so I was already a little frightened. They had this painting of a lady in the middle of the room. Brandy said it was there when they moved in, and her parents liked it, so they left it up. It was so creepy. It seems like wherever you went, the eyes they seemed to follow you. We started talking about taboo girl stuff until we heard a knock at the door. We both jumped as it was a loud knock. When the police are at your door, they kind of knock very hard and persistent. We both went over and looked out the window, turned on the lights, and no one was there. We figured it was someone for her sister and realized she lived downstairs. We sat back down. Then the knock came again. This time we looked out. The light was off outside and we saw someone bent down looking in at us, but the eyes were blood red. We screamed and ran back to the couch and called our parents. The knocking stopped as soon as we picked up the phone. Her parents said it was probably her sister trying to scare us and not to worry. It happened one more time, and afterwards her sister came to the door and yelled for us to stop trying to get her in trouble. She had been gone and just got back. At this point, I was scared to death. Her sister went back downstairs and we sat in the living room talking. Brandy proceeded to tell me that her house was haunted and she has seen things ever since she was little. I laughed at her at first because she was serious. They had those old school wooden forks and spoons that people used to hang up on the wall. Well, they flew across the room at us. Now, I am scared to death. Needless to say, that frantic call got her parents home. After they were home, we were ready for bed. I wanted to go home, but they were in no shape to drive me. I had to go to the bathroom. As I walked out of the room to the bathroom, I heard a little boy cry. And that was when I saw a little boy crying and run into the closet. Not into the closet, through the door. I called my parents and were home. Later, I found out a boy about 3 years old, had died there because his mother left him alone with no food or heat and never came back. He was so scared he hid in the closet, and that's where he died. I lost touch with Brandy after they moved, and when she was in middle school, I found her number and called. She says she was still being haunted by something or someone. She said she felt like it was evil, and her parents even had attempted to have an exorcism done. I lost track of her after that, though. I do wonder sometimes what happened.
I've always been a staunch skeptic. Even growing up in a heavily superstitious and religious family, I always looked for the most logical reasoning behind everything. Despite all that, there was one night I've never found any rational explanation for. About 6 years ago, my then boyfriend, let's call him Chad, lived with me in a small house on the outskirts of town. It was a little run down, but it was still decent, with a detached garage and a nice backyard for our dogs. We even had a small creek at the edge of the property where the yard gave way to woods. Considering that we were only 20 at the time, we often spent nights out with friends. On one of these nights, we were out with a mutual friend named John. We had all gone to another friend's house together and were returning to ours around midnight. Mind you, we had not been drinking or doing anything else like that. It had been a simple movie and a card game night. Anyway, John had parked in our driveway and we were just sitting there talking before getting out so he could go home himself. Everything was fine and we were having a great time until my boyfriend began to yell. "What in the world?" From the front passenger seat. I was sitting in the back, leaning up between the front seats as we were talking. I looked to where he was pointing and saw the headlights of John's car shining over the trees behind our backyard. But then I saw movement. Whatever it was gone before I could process anything other than the white birch trees. I was confused, but John was already putting the car into reverse and drove off down the road, yelling, "What was that?" I see Chad is now physically shaking in the front seat, and I'm begging them to tell me what happened, to tell me what they saw. Finally, while staring out the window as if looking for some other evidence of what he saw, he tells me there was something in the trees. At first he thought it was just another birch, but then it moved. It was shaped like a person, but his posture was off, and his limbs were gnarled like the branches. The reason Chad didn't notice it at first was because the thing's skin looked exactly like the birch bark surrounding it, almost like a camouflage. It was only then when it began to move that he realized that this thing was no tree at all. And by the time my eyes followed where he was pointing, the creature had already vanished behind the trees. Maybe it wasn't the smartest thing, but as scared as I was, I couldn't just leave our dogs behind. Both of them were still inside the house. I told John to stop, that we have to go back for them. After a bit of convincing, he turned the car around. When we pulled up, we cautiously stared at the tree line. Nothing moved. Everything looked exactly as it always had. And yet somehow, that area was so much more sinister than it was before. We waited a few moments, then John hit the button that unlocks the trunk. I should add that John is ex-military, and our group of friends have never been able to surprise, prank, or scare him before. Not much rattles the guy. After pulling away from the house, he hadn't said much. Instead, he began to gear up. He pulled out a long-bladed knife from under his seat, then got out. He went around to his trunk, grabbed a tire iron, and handed it to Chad, then a baseball bat for me. This guy was prepared. When I unlocked the door and turned on the light in the living room, the first thing I saw was our youngest dog, Bandit. Bandit was a Chihuahua Wiener dog mix, and was only about 6 months old at the time. He was huddled there where the couch met the wall, and he looked absolutely petrified. He was so scared that even as I walked up to him, he kept backing away until he tumbled off the edge of the corner where the two walls met. Even as I picked him up, he could only cower and whimper. Next, I went to find Barkley, our 1-year-old beagle. Usually, he would meet us at the door with boundless enthusiasm, but that night, he was hiding in our bedroom. I found him hunched in the corner, silent and obviously afraid. After checking all the doors and windows, we gathered some overnight necessities and loaded everything back up in the cars and left for John's house. Chad and I stayed with the dogs in John's living room that night. We all slept with the lights on. Luckily, we never saw that creature again, but even still, we moved shortly after. I couldn't stand the thought of whatever that was, just hanging out in our backyard, blending in almost perfectly. To this day, my husband still has nightmares about what he saw. We don't talk about it. Neither does John. I've tried so many times to rationalize what happened that night. I've never been able to come to a logical conclusion. I guess sometimes there just isn't one.
I have lived in my current house for about 7 years. It's a 2-bedroom building, and just myself and my husband live here. I have always felt something in this house. When we first moved in, I kept hearing a scratching noise coming from our attic. We checked and there were no signs of any rodents. Eventually, I asked whatever it was to leave my house, and the sound seemingly stopped. Over the years, there have been strange events like my TV turning itself on, light flickering, strange noises from outside, and seeing people out of the corner of my eye. They have not been too bothered because it felt like whatever it was quite peaceful. That was until last week. I have recently changed jobs and have an unusual sleeping pattern. So, not to disturb my husband some nights, I will sleep in our spare bedroom. There is definitely something different about this room. The temperature can suddenly drop, and it has a general eerie vibe. I have my 2 cockatiels in this room, and quite often in the early hours they will get spooked and start flapping about. When I sleep in there, I keep a dim lamp on because I am too afraid to sleep in there in the complete darkness. And I also wear an eye mask. Last week, I went to sleep in the spare bedroom with my eye mask on and dim lamp. I was on my back and just drifting off to sleep when I felt some anxious feeling. All of a sudden, I snapped out of drifting to sleep and woke up. I opened my eyes. I could just see a small part of the room through a gap in the bottom part of my eye mask. I looked up and to my side. I made eye contact with someone, stood over me, who instantly rushed towards me and was trying to strangle me through the bed covers. I couldn't move, and all I could see was this person's eyes. Even though this was all I could see, I knew it was an older lady, and I sensed nothing but pure hatred from this being towards me. It was over quite quickly, and it was terrifying. In the past, I have experienced sleep paralysis and have been attacked by shadow people, so I put it down to this, that I didn't realize I was asleep. I told my sister about it, and she was terrified, telling me that if it was a ghost, it was not a nice one. She said it could be sleep paralysis, but it's definitely plausible, but with all the shadow people that I've seen, it might not be. I clearly made eye contact with them and saw their eyes in full color. I was wondering if anyone has experienced anything similar, or if they have any tips on how I can protect myself from this happening again. Any help would be appreciated. Thank you for sharing my story.
In 1998, I was stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado in the U.S. Army. I had a friend, his name was Frank, that I lived with in some barracks. Frank had a rough 18 years of life being raised in the projects of Washington, D.C. He was involved in a gang called the Crips, and on this particular evening, he had recently lost a friend back home who was killed by a rival gang. Upset and distraught, he came to my room in the barracks, begging me if I could take him for a ride just to get away. Living in the barracks could be really boring, and it was even worse if he didn't have a vehicle to drive around in. I just so happened to be one of those few individuals who had a vehicle, so I was constantly being asked by people in the barracks to take them somewhere. Oftentimes I was forced to tell people no, because if you always said yes, people would constantly be at your door trying to borrow your vehicle or get them a ride. This evening I felt real empathy for Frank and his loss. I remember him telling me, "Let's go to the Gold Camp Road." The Gold Camp Road was once an old railroad that led up into the mountains above Colorado Springs. The railroad had been long gone, and it was converted into a road for tourism that led into the Front Range of the Rockies. The road had a long history of violence and death, and of being very haunted, especially the railroad tunnels on the road that literally went through the mountain. I agreed to give Frank a ride and told him I would come to his room in a few minutes. I quickly put on a light jacket and some running shoes and a pair of shorts. I remember before leaving, I noticed a weather report on the TV, and the meteorologist was giving a stern warning not to go into the mountains this evening due to a low front moving in from the northwest, causing wind chill temperatures 25 below zero, with blizzard-like conditions. Being a 19-year-old fit soldier, I thought that I could take on the world and there was no way a blizzard was going to destroy my plans. I met up with Frank, and as we were walking to my tiny two-wheel drive Chevy S10 pickup truck, the cold north wind was already ripping through my light jacket like razor-sharp knives and was chilling me to the bone. The Gold Camp Row was about a 20-minute drive off the post, and we had no issues getting there, other than a few strong wind gusts that attempted to blow my little truck off course. The Gold Campsite, despite having some creepy ghost stories in the old scary railroad tunnels, also had some really awesome picturesque overlooks. My favorite one was near the top of the highest point of the Gold Camp, which not only allowed you to see most of Colorado Springs, but also allowed you to see the winding Gold Camp Road several miles in either direction. I and Frank decided to stop there and burn down a pack of cigarettes, and just lay back and chill, taking in the beauty of the city below. This outlook had a small-sized parking area, and after sitting there for about 30 minutes with the heater on full blast, the night came on suddenly. It was then that we started to notice a few snowflakes whipping around in the breeze. These few snowflakes should have been my cue to get out of Dodge and head home, but we decided to stay and kick back smoking a few more clouds of smoke before heading back down the mountain and back to the post. Suddenly, the snow picked up and a few snowflakes became millions in no time. The small gravel parking lot started getting covered with a blanket of snow. The parking lot was small and had a slight incline, and attempting to pull out almost put you in the ditch on the opposite side of the road. Seeing the situation becoming more and more dangerous by the minute, I decided it was time to get back to the post. However, being fairly new at driving a gear shift, to accidentally pop the clutch when I tried to put my truck in reverse, and it caused my S10 to slide, knocking my rear passenger side tire right off that little ditch across the road. Quickly putting in first gear, I tried to drive forward, but my little truck didn't have the power to free me from being stuck. To make things worse, it was at this point I noticed my gas gauge needle was right on the E. That's just great, I thought. Frank had the idea of trying to rock the truck while the other got out and pushed. I remember stepping out of the truck, and my bare hands immediately started freezing. I'm a very big man, and I tried with all my might to push and lift the truck back onto the road, but it was to no avail. This thing was not coming free. After several attempts of both me and Frank trying to get the wheel out of the ditch, we noticed the wheel had dug a deeper rut in the icy mud, making a serious situation even more serious. Gold Camp Road is often a busy road, but on this night there was no one on this road. Apparently, people had watched the weather reports and weren't stupid enough like me and Frank to go up and decide to drive in the mountains during the blizzard. Seeing that the snow was worsening by the minute, and after about 20 or 30 minutes of trying to get the truck free, panic began to set in, as I knew my truck was going to run out of gas and would be freeze to death. I remember looking desperately down both directions on the Gold Camp, and there was no one. Attempting to push again, I decided to say a little prayer to myself. Please God, don't let me die up here. Immediately as I thought those words of that prayer, I heard a truck door slam behind me, and in shock, I turned and saw this old chubby man standing there with a friendly grin on his face. It was as if he appeared out of nowhere. I remember Frank was just as perplexed as I was. Neither one of us saw any headlights coming up on the Gold Camp in either direction for miles. The man, strangely enough, reminded me of Santa Claus. He had a chubby frame, a flowing white beard, a long ruffled white hair. The man had a very cheerful and happy demeanor, and despite the circumstance, didn't seem to have a care in the world. "Oh my, that is really bad indeed," he said. "I tell you what, you young men just get in the truck and get warm, and I'll get you out." Puzzled, I replied, Sir, not to be rude, but I'm a big guy and I couldn't get it to budge, so I don't know if you'll be able to." Now, young man, if you have faith the size of mustard seed, you can move the mountain. Well, okay. So I jumped in the truck, and what happened next still puzzles me to this very day. This chubby little man literally picked up the entire back of the pickup truck off the ground and moved it so my tires were back on the road again. Frank, spooked by this man's incredible feat, yelled out, "Did you see that? He has picked up the truck." Relieved and happy, I quickly grabbed my wallet to give the man a few dollars for the trouble. He quickly replied, "Young man, I have no need for your money, as I have no use for it. Now, if you drive straight ahead and take your time, you'll get to the gas station at the bottom of the mountain." I remember after he said this, I looked at my gas gauge with a little doubt, as I knew that gas station was at least 5 miles. "Faith, friend, have faith," was his last statement before he kind of faded off with a cold north wind. I then said, "Well, sir, thank you once again." At that moment, I looked up at him to thank him. I swear on everything I know, he was gone. It was as if he vanished into thin air. There was no old man and there was no trucks. Just God. There were no tire tracks other than my own. Fearful that he may have slid off the side of the mountain, I and Frank got out and looked around in the darkness, and there was nothing but flakes of snow dancing all around in the cold night air. I took his advice and drove slowly down the mountain and made it to the gas station just as the old man had predicted. When I and Frank were traveling back to the post that night, we got to thinking about what had just happened. Upon thinking back, we realized despite the man having a very friendly and warm demeanor, he seemed to radiate warmth as we both sensed when he was near us. We didn't feel that bitter cold wind from the blizzard. Secondly, how did he know the truck was out of gas? I never mentioned that. The last odd thing we encountered other than his sudden appearance and disappearance was the way he told us to travel. It was definitely not the way he came in, because he did not tell us the roads. The only explanation that I can think of all these years later was the stranger in the storm was an angel sent by God to protect us, many miles away from home. What do you guys think?
What I'm about to tell you is a true story. I don't care if anyone believes me or not. I only want an answer as to what this thing was, and how to kill it, if it ever came down to me and it. One thing you need to know is that I'm ex-military. I've had some combat experience. After I came back stateside for good, I found an old log cabin at the lake in the Ozarks. It was a nice place. It was away from everything, so it was quiet most of the time. This I absolutely loved. Now, in my cabin there are 2 floors. On the top floor, there is a long hallway that connects every room there together. The cabin itself is a good 10 miles from the nearest gas station. Now, I may not be the best writer or a storyteller, but I feel it's about time I told someone this experience. One day, I was coming home from a good day of fishing. My boxer Dutch was riding shotgun with me. He had his head out of the window of my pickup, like he always did. As we reached the house, I saw my front door was completely busted open, and my front window was broken. From the inside, I could tell, because all the glass was shattered on the outside. I got out of my truck cautiously to go check it out, and I found something odd. There were these claw marks all over the door. The marks were at least 2 inches deep and 8 inches long. So I spent that entire evening putting my door back up and boarding up that window. I was making dang sure that whatever it was, it would take a lot more for it to break down the door again. That night, I woke up around 1:30. Dutch was barking his head off, going crazy. I had no idea what the heck was going on, so I got up to go check it out. But halfway down the hallway, I could no longer hear Dutch barking. I've had that dog since he was a pup. He's been with me for years, and he'll bark at almost anything non-stop. I was panicked now, and it was an emergency. I rushed down the hallway, only to see this thing. This thing was skinny. Its skin was very pale white, and there was only a little bit of hair on the thing's body. It was standing over Dutch, who was now lying on the ground, completely motionless. I couldn't breathe. I slowly stepped backwards, trying to get to one of my guns from my room. Unfortunately, the wooden board I was standing on creaked. Perfect timing. At that very moment, I looked back up at the thing, hoping it hadn't heard me. But now, its eyes were locked onto mine. Those eyes were like big black pulls. What few hairs it had on its head stood up. It cocked its head at me, and then it spoke. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear to God, this thing spoke to me. Human words. Come here. All I could think after that was, what on earth was this thing? I turned and ran for my bedroom. When I spun around to shut the door, the thing was now standing in the hallway behind me, standing exactly like it was before, as if it had perfectly kept pace with me, and stopped the moment I turned around. That in itself was bone-chilling. And then I heard it speak to me again. Come here. I slammed the door and locked it, and shoved my dresser in front of it just in case. But for the rest of the night, all I could hear from outside the door was, come here, come here. It would repeat the same phrase, the same way, looping those words for the next hour or so, before I finally heard it walk away and leave the house. Needless to say, I didn't come out of my room until morning. The first thing I did, though, when I came out, was go and check on Dutch. But Dutch hadn't moved. He didn't make it. This was about 2 years ago. Since then, I've set up cameras all over the place, hoping against hope to see that thing again. I want to make it pay for taking my Dutch away from me.
I went to a small school, better known as Hyatt High School. It's in Louisiana, and it's on my paranormal websites. It has a history of strange stuff happening, but I never noticed anything strange when I attended the school. It was shut down until one day. Some friends and I were in the gym, just goofing off, doing nothing serious. I distinctly remember hearing whispering like little kids whispering, to which I paid no attention to. Then, we had a brilliant idea of going into the basement, the dark basement. I'm not sure why we chose to, but the whole time I felt as if we were being watched, but I still didn't pay any attention to it. We went down below and the air was incredibly thin and cold, which is weird for Louisiana weather, but it just felt that way. There was a door on the other side of the room which leads to an exit. It was an old white door, and I remember putting my ear up to it because I heard a strange noise coming from the other side. Okay, this is going to sound crazy, but this is what I heard. It sounded like hooves trotting on a hard surface, similar to cobblestone, and to get closer and louder until, in my opinion, it sounded like someone slapped the door as hard as they could. We took off running, of course, but it doesn't stop there. There are these huge metal screen doors that were in place of the equipment room, which is located near the basement. As I ran by them, the door flung open and hit me. These doors aren't little either. They're massive. The whole time I felt like I was being chased. When we got out, I felt so relieved. Like, I'm going to use this term evil thing, wasn't there anymore. I also noticed 3 distinctive marks that looked like scratches alongside my upper right chest as well. I haven't been near that door or that place in general ever again. If someone can explain this to me, or tell me what they think had happened, I very much appreciate that. So this isn't my story, but my best friend's. She told me about her uncle, that is, her stepdad's brother, and how sketchy he was. There's always one questionable uncle in every family, isn't there? My friend said that a few years ago, whenever she would meet up with her step-uncle, he would always give her the creeps. He would say things like, "The wife and I are going to the trailer for a week, and you should come along." "Oh, my wife is only going to be there for a couple of days, but you're welcome to stay as long as you like." Not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but the way he said it made her feel really uncomfortable. He would bring her presents all of the time and find any excuse to be alone with her. She said that he would often come by her tattoo shop when there was no one else around, despite living an hour away. There was only one door to that shop, so she would often be stuck in there either until closing time or until step-uncle decided to leave. And when he hugged her, his hands would go too low and his hug would last too long. I can't remember if I ever met this guy, but I was very familiar with my friend's stepdad and I never cared for him either. So safe to say that it isn't a stretch to imagine this. What makes me angry is that my friend finally confessed to her stepdad and told him what had been going on and how it upset her. But the guy didn't even believe her. Nothing was done because good old uncle was just trying to be nice and my friend was quote-unquote overreacting. About 3 years ago, my friend's life became so much more difficult. Her mother suddenly passed away, which was very sad for everyone involved. With all the stress and grief involved, my friend was at her wit's end. Her mother's memorial service was held at a home, and the entire family came by to give their condolences. My friend was lost in all of it, not sure what to think. Of course, Uncle was there. Sometime during the service, he came up to her, gave him one of his 2 long hugs with the 2 low hands, and whispered in her ear, "I dream of you." My friend said she sat on the porch and couldn't function for hours. Super creepy. I really can't explain why this guy acts this way. Think he might be some sort of psychopath or sociopath or something. He just seems like he has his evil presence.